When was the last time you disobeyed a direct order from your CO? We look at Lieutenant Russell McCure of the 4th Anti-Tank Regiment and his displays of moral courage in Malaya. Welcome to episode 14 of the Principles of War podcast, Moral Courage at the Battle of Bakri. Today we're going to follow the story of Lieutenant Russell McCure, who was a gunner in the 4th Anti-Tank Regiment. Now, I've got most of this material from some interviews that were conducted with him. These are actual audio interviews that are stored on the Australian War Memorial site. And it is a cracking yarn. It reads like a boy's own adventure, the way that he tells it. And it is really an amazing story. So he was in Malaya for the duration, never got captured by the Japanese, ended up being captured by the Chinese, actually, and was became increasingly detained by them. Now, we won't cover much of that, but if you're interested, have a listen to this. I'll include a link on the show notes because it really is a cracking yarn. What we want to focus on is his preparation for and the conduct at the Battle of Bakri. So he was originally posted in a searchlight battery, so the 53rd ACAC searchlight battery, and this was pre-war. He wanted to join the AIF, and at that time there weren't any transfers from the CMF to the AIF. But his OC said that he would pull some strings and see what he could do, and he was able to do that as long as he would get his commission. So he was moved to the 58th Infantry Battalion, which was parading out at Essendon at that time, and he was parading 2 nights a week. And interestingly, he was travelling from Brighton all the way to Essendon. You can imagine how long that trip would have taken him on public transport. His commissioning course, 4 weeks at Pakapanyal. So that's the accelerated training option for officers during the war. So this would have been 1939 after war had been declared. From there he went to Holsworthy and did his artillery anti-tank course and eventually deployed to Malaya. He was in the part of the first push, so deployed with other 8th Division units on the Queen Mary and arrived mid-February in 1941. And from there they commenced to do their training, familiarisation with the terrain. So as a lieutenant in an artillery battery, he would have been a troop commander, and he would have had 4 guns that he was responsible for. The anti-tank role was still a very new role, and so the doctrine hadn't really been fully developed, and they were working on developing that while they were out in Malaya. One of the issues that they had was how were they going to transport the guns around? And so what they were at one stage they were experimenting with having them on the trucks, so the crew and the gun and the ammunition would all be stored on a truck. And they had an interesting field exercise where they were going to deploy and everything needed to be loaded on the truck. They loaded up everything without the crew, and the truck looked fairly overloaded. And one of the gunners leant on the back of the truck and the truck started tipping. So it was so closely balanced that just the weight of someone leaning on the back of the truck was able to tip the front of the truck up. So not the safest condition to be transporting a gun, and particularly live ammunition. One of the other troops had come to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be safe, and they decided that they weren't going to go. McCure discussed it with his troop sergeant and the gunners, and they decided that they weren't going to go. Now, he informed their headquarters that it was too unsafe because they weren't going on formed roads. They were actually going on very bumpy roads, so it would have been a very, very dangerous trip. He notified regimental headquarters. An officer came down and he was summarily removed from command, and he was sent back to regimental headquarters. This is one of those first examples where we're starting to see his idea of moral courage coming in. And so moral courage is the courage to take action for moral reasons despite the risk of adverse consequences. Courage is required to take the action when one has doubts or fears about the consequences. Moral courage therefore involves deliberate or careful thought. And this is opposed to physical courage, which is the storming the enemy position. That's physical courage. Moral courage often where it takes courage to do an act. The easy thing is to not do anything. And so it would have been a lot easier for him to do nothing in this case, just tell the troops to get on the back of the truck and that it'll be all right. But because of the fact that he was very uncomfortable with how safe it was, and he wasn't the only one with that, his troop sergeant had concerns, and the other troop as well, they'd refused to go. He thought that the troop's safety was more important than following the order to attend the exercise. And he paid for that. And they subsequently decided that was a better way of actually transporting the guns, but he lost his role as the troop commander for that. So heading into Bakri, Bill McCure is still at regimental headquarters, and a word comes down from 8 Div headquarters that 2nd 29th is to move out to Bakri. There's been a sighting of a patrol of Japanese troops. So they are there going to go out and clear them. And they're to take some anti-tank guns. And this is the opportunity for Bill to get back into the action. So they're going to create a composite troop with 2 guns from 13th and 2 guns from 16th Battery. And they need a troop commander to lead them. There's him or Jack Ross. That's the other lieutenant who was sacked in the truck drama. And they flip a ruler to see who's going to command this composite troop. And Bill wins. So they're heading out. Now, the interesting thing is that he says what Lieutenant Colonel Robertson said to him. I have orders from the general that I should be accompanied by a troop of anti-tank guns. But as far as I'm concerned, you're not wanted. I don't want you to interfere with us in any way. I don't expect the Japanese to use tanks. So for my part, you can go home. Now, despite that, he organises with the battalion staff a place in the convoy and they head out. On the way to Muir, he says that he has another run-in with Lieutenant Colonel Robertson. And they'd stopped at an airfield and they'd called for an O group. And he was attending with his troop sergeant. On seeing the sergeant, the colonel immediately says, what is he attending the O group for? And Bill says, well, as part of Anti-Tank Regiment, our SOPs are for the troop commander to be accompanied by his troop sergeant at these meetings so that if anything happens to him, he'll be able to, when he takes over command, he'll have a thorough understanding of the current situation. Lieutenant Colonel Robertson didn't agree with that and told him to dismissing. And Bill said, well, I can't do that because that's part of our procedures and this is my commitment to the regiment. And Robertson then said, well, then I dismiss you both. Now, by way of context, Robertson gets his orders on the 17th of January. So this is just 3 days after the ambush at Gamas. Gamas is about 80 kilometres to the north. The problem that the 2nd 29th is dealing with is that the 45th Indian Brigade under Brigadier Duncan is fighting at Muar. And it's Japanese infantry that looks like it's moving around the flanks of the troops at Muar. So Muar's on the coast. Bakri is about 3 kilometres to the southeast of Muar. And so this is where they're going to clear these Japanese that are threatening one of the withdrawal routes for the 45th Indian Infantry Brigade. So they get to the position for the night lock and the troops are on the ground. It's very clear that Lieutenant Colonel Robertson doesn't want the guns anywhere near his troops. However, Bill, with some assistance from the officers in the battalion headquarters, places the guns where he thinks is most appropriate for them. So he places 2 guns forward of the infantry to cover a sweep in the road, and about 400 yards down the road, he places the other 2 guns to back them up, to provide some depth to the position. That night, there's contact, and it's a significant contact, and it's apparent to everyone that they're up against more than a single Japanese patrol. The next morning, as Bill puts it, all hell breaks loose. Tanks from the Gotanda Medium Tank Company are advancing down the cutting and they're attempting a filleting attack on the battalion positions. The 2 front guns engage the targets. They engage with armour-piercing rounds and they're able to go through the armour of the tanks. They're able to disable the tanks, but not the crew. So the crews are still operating the guns of the tanks. Now, Bill sets up his troop headquarters in a small scraping just behind the 2 front guns. They're engaging the tanks with armour-piercing rounds, and Clary Thornton on the front gun calls out for HE. The armour-piercing's going straight through the tanks, and it's not disabling them. So, and in fact, 2 tanks make it through the position and are engaged by the rear guns before they're destroyed. Bill starts carrying up HE rounds to them, and in total, 8 tanks are destroyed. This blunts the armoured threat to the battalion. But the Japanese, because their filleting attack has been halted, they start fighting for the road, off the road, and they're feeling for the flanks of the 2nd 29th, and they begin their envelopment. This engagement produces probably the most iconic photo of the Malaya and probably the Singapore campaign, particularly from an Australian Army point of view. And this is of an anti-tank gun, the 2-pounder anti-tank, commanded by Sergeant Charlie Parsons of the 2nd 4th Anti-Tank Regiment. Now, the amazing thing is that this is the rear pair of the two guns. The forward two guns, commanded by Sergeant Charlie Parsons, are the two guns that had been bypassed by the tanks. It appears that they weren't aware of the two guns that they were facing, the two forward guns. And this really highlights one of the big issues of tanks with their limited visibility when they're closed up for combat and the need to be supported by infantry. So you've got infantry, there's no infantry support here, and the tanks pay a very heavy price for it. The history of the Imperial Guards noted that the advance by the tank company was careless and mistaken. That was definitely what happened. They paid a very heavy price for not having the tanks with the infantry. However, time and time again, the Japanese had been trading off the cooperation effect of combined arms in order to gain more offensive action, to move quicker. Having suffered the casualties that they'd taken, infantry moves up. They're content to sit on the road in front of the Australians and start that flanking manoeuvre. They're going to fight for the road, off the road, and they start moving around. They're starting to feel for the flanks of the Australian position. And it's important to remember that the 2nd 29th isn't attempting to manoeuvre at this point. So Robertson isn't moving any of his troops, which means that the road that they came in on is now has Japanese troops on it. Lieutenant Colonel Robertson, he attempts to get word to Div headquarters, and he rides pillion passenger. Now, we're not sure what actually happened, but he's shot and falls off. They send one of the small APCs to go and pick him up, and Bill says, they weren't worth a pinch of salt. They ended up like a colander. There were so many holes through them. But they go back, they pick up Robertson, and they bring him back. And it just so happens that he is placed, he's mortally wounded at this point, and they place him right next to Bill. And Robertson looks up at him and says, "I'm so sorry. Only for your persistence in defying my orders and positioning your guns where you did, there would have been wholesale slaughter." Now, Robertson passed away shortly after that. Now, when you look at the actions of Robertson, I think it's important to recognise a couple of things. No one's ever questioned his physical courage. He had significant World War I experience. He joined the militia in 1911 and he was promoted to second lieutenant in 1914. In 1915, he joined the 1st AIF as a private, and he served with the 23rd Battalion. He received his commission in the field at the Battle of Pozieres in 1916, and for his work at Bullecourt the following year, he was awarded the Military Cross, and he was twice wounded. He also had interwar experience, so he served with the 23rd 21st Battalion, which was the Geelong part of the Geelong Regiment, as a captain, and later as a major and 2IC. And in 1940, he joined the 2nd AIF and was given command of the battalion. So the question is, why did he act the way that he acted? And I think there's a couple of points that are important to remember here. Firstly, there is the training of the battalion COs. So how was he trained when it came to combined arms? And everything that I've been able to read has been that, in general, not well. There were significant problems with combined arms training, particularly in 8th Division. It wasn't well understood. Now, was this an Australian problem? I don't think so. Because when you look at the experience of Lieutenant Colonel Stewart of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, he did particularly poorly when he was attacked by tanks. And he said, so he took full ownership of it. He said, "I botched that." But he said, "In my defence, I had never been trained in fighting tanks, and I had no idea that they would use tanks down the road at night. So the training that they have got around this has not set the COs up well for performing in a combined arms environment with a tank threat. Secondly, why would he dismiss the troop sergeant in the O group? And I can only think that this is probably a behaviour that has been modelled on what he has been exposed to, because this sounds like a very British, a very old-fashioned way of interacting with non-commissioned officers. No, this O group is for officers only. That's very elitist, and I'm wondering if this is a behaviour that he has modelled on what he has seen in the interactions with other officers, potentially from the British Army. Bearing in mind, of course, that it could just be the way that those sort of interactions were back then, with the Army in general not being overly inclusive when it came to non-commissioned officers. Lastly, there is the role that the system plays in the selection of battalion commanders. And I get the impression that he was doing the best that he could with the training that he'd had. Really, he needed some mentoring about, there's got to be a better way of interacting with the supporting arms. He would never have received that. And we know that because at a divisional level, there was a very clear divide and a negative attitude towards the value that supporting arms could provide. And it wasn't just in 8th Division, that was across Malaya Command in general. So Robertson, a very brave officer, doing the best that he could given the training that he'd had. When you listen to Bill's tapes, there's a couple of other stories that he has that really do highlight the role of leadership in the battle. And I find it really quite interesting because the work that Bill did in this engagement is sterling. No one would really question it, displaying great courage, great physical courage as well as moral courage to continue to keep the guns fed in what is really quite a hectic and frightening environment. But he says, courage, I didn't have it. And he said, he was very, very scared. But, obviously the courage is the ability to be scared and to do something that needs to be done. That's the big part of courage. But he said that one of the things that really helped him was that he saw a British officer walking through the position. And he was just strolling around. He was 100% in command of the situation, 100% command of himself. And Bill just looked at him and thought, wow, if he can do that, then I can as well. So he drew a lot of strength from that officer. After the engagement, there was an officer from the Madras sappers, and he came up to Bill and said, we need to sort out these tanks. And Bill thought, well, yeah, someone needs to. What's going to happen? And so this officer got Bill to come with him, and they basically opened up the tanks and dropped charges in there and killed the surviving Japanese in the tanks. He said, wow, this guy, he had courage. He knew exactly what needed to be done, and he did that. You can tell from the way that he tells that story, this is where he is getting his concept of the courage under fire, the leadership component that he displayed. After this, they start their withdrawal, and it's quite a hellish withdrawal. The Japanese troops are on the road. They knew that the road was blocked because the trucks had stopped coming through. They had no comms at this point. And this is why Robertson had gone forward with a rider to try and get through. They didn't have radio comms, which is a not insignificant failure of the comms plan, and comes back to this issue that there was a distrust of radios because they thought that the Japanese would be able to use direction finding gear to work out their location. And it might have also been the fact that there was a lack of SIG equipment and SIGs in general. Now, sometime after the engagement, they're still in danger of envelopment. The 2nd 19th fight their way through, with Lieutenant Colonel Anderson leading them. They marry up and then they start the withdrawal. It's quite a messy situation, and not all of the troops are able to withdraw with Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. And Bill is a not insignificant party that gets detached from the main body. And he describes quite a hellish situation. They're forced into the swamp, and the swamp is chest deep. And he said that there are soldiers perched in the trees with wounds. Many of them had were begging to be put out of their misery. Now, the group that they were in, there was a significant number of Indian troops who were withdrawing with them. They were in the vanguard of their group and they were taking very heavy casualties. At one stage, he's walking behind the Battalion 2IC who's taken over, and he's walking and then all of a sudden a red hole appears in his back and he just drops dead. Bill picked up his carry bag and his maps and they continue on. As nightfall nears, they come to a swamp and they're wading through it. He describes exploding shells, flares, shooting all around them as they're trying to move through this swamp. They come over there under artillery fire from their own artillery. And he said that there were men just falling all around us. And the thing that stuck with him, the agonising cries of the badly wounded men begging us to put them out of their misery, he said it was soul-destroying. In total darkness, they waded through the swamp and ultimately they reached the other side. There weren't any Japanese in the vicinity, and so they just collapsed on the dry ground, completely exhausted. After that, there was a discussion about what they should try and do. They were now behind enemy lines, and it was agreed that they weren't going to be able to make it back to friendly positions. There's only one way that they could get across to Singapore, and that was through the causeway. And as Malaya sort of narrows as it gets further down south, they just thought that the concentration of Japanese was going to be increasing, and it was highly unlikely that they were going to be able to get through. This is the start of his time working behind the lines. He meets up with a British soldier, a guy called Jock Smiley, who was acting as a commando in a stay-behind role. And they started basing themselves out of the Sock Fin estate, which was one of the big British oil palm plantations. And they'd been able to find reserves of food, arms and ammunition, which had been stockpiled there or cached there prior to the Japanese moving through. Now, and he has a cracking time of it. They have access to explosives, which they use to blow up the train track on multiple occasions, derailing Japanese transport. But eventually they start running out of supplies. They come up with the idea of trying to get to the coast and to get a boat to take them off Malaya. That doesn't work out well for them. They end up finding a Chinese communist group and they start working with them. Initially, they're doing training in small arms with them. They do pickets, but over time, they become increasingly isolated and their weapons are taken off them and they're held as kind of prisoners. And that continues on for the rest of the war, moving around from camp to camp. And there's a few other Australians with him. One of them is actually shot, falls asleep on picket one night. The Chinese get attacked and he was on picket with a Japanese soldier. The Japanese soldier gets transferred somewhere else and the Australian is executed. So it's an amazing story that he's got, and it's definitely worth the listen for it. It goes for about 4 hours, but it's really, really interesting. I picked Bill's story because I think it is a really good example of moral courage. How many people would have done what he did, actively work against the intent of the CO to place the guns, particularly when they were in a low anti-tank threat environment? And thank God that he did, because the 2nd 29th would have been completely filleted by those tanks had it not been for his actions in placing the guns where he placed them. So an excellent example of moral courage, and although he would deny it, also an excellent example of physical courage as well. The next episode is going to pick up where we've left off with the 2nd 29th and 2nd 19th as we look at Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. So a Lieutenant Colonel who goes on to be awarded a Victoria Cross for his actions during the withdrawal from Bakri. This is quite an amazing story, and there's definitely a lot that can be learnt from this.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.